Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome online and in person to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks so much for joining us for this talk and workshop facilitated by Kristen Lewis that will explore the concept of interactivity in art through both theoretical reflection and engaged aesthetic activity. Can't wait. Before we launch into it, I would like to remind everyone that we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Jogage, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our community here at the university to help mobilize and exchange knowledge through various activities on the daily. And we're so excited to work with DIGS and FMS folks here this week. Kristen's work is right behind me in the space. We invite you to come on down and check it out before the end of the week if you're available. That's it for me. I'll remind you, folks who are in the room, if you want to jump into the conversation, let us pass you a mic so that we can hear you on the recording. And if you're joining us online, feel free to jump in by raising a hand and we'll call on you. Thanks, everyone. Over to, I think it's Chris who's introducing Kristen. Right on.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the territorial acknowledgement. I have the privilege of presenting Kristen Lewis today, who is an artist, writer, and researcher currently pursuing a PhD in art history at Concordia. Her current research explores the concept of non-participation in contemporary art, looking in particular at how interactive and participatory art thematize and enact the tensions of this concept. Kristen is inquiring into how technological developments in art making have complicated the terms of participation, thereby challenging what it means for both artists and spectators to refuse participation. Beyond her research, Kristen has published creative work with local Montreal collectives and written for local galleries and magazines. Today, Kristen will be giving a talk that interrogates our increased interest in the participatory and interactive practices of art making. This will be followed by an active listening workshop with a stethoscope microphone reflective of her art practice in the Digital Intimacies submission, Sonic Reticulum. The workshop looks to explore where theoretical reflection enables us to understand interactivity better and where perhaps theory falls short of capturing interactive and intersubjective aesthetic experience. Kristen Lewis, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just gonna share my screen. And go to slideshow. Okay. So as Chris mentioned, thank you. I'm going to be doing a little bit of a talk and then a little bit of a workshop. So the Krispy Kreme donuts will be for those in person. My sincerest apologies for those who are online and unable to interact with them. So I just kind of want to explore something that I've been thinking about in relationship to my dissertation research. They're kind of like half-baked ideas, things that I'm trying to kind of unpack through discussion. So I hope that we can have a little bit of that as well, perhaps over a donut or two and through some active listening to our guests. But first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about participatory art, interactive art, and what I see to be a kind of dominant trend in the status of art making today with respect to these different forms of art making. So on this screen that you see here is Ihanowitz's The Just Tetner. And this was an early interactive work that was like a HCI robot that would respond back to the gestures of participants who were engaging with it. So if you waved at it, it would kind of move towards you. And it was one of the early interactive digital works, or not digital, but interactive technological works that kind of inspired some of my thinking around this stuff. And I just love this photo. Okay, so participation, that skipped a slide. Nope, participation and interaction in art. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what participatory art is and what interaction in art is, interactive art, and where I see some of those differences. And some of those differences are kind of fall short of actually capturing, I think, what happens within those different art forms, because all these genres eventually kind of bleed together. You have kind of socially engaged art, you have participatory art, you have interactive installation, and all those kind of genres bleed together at some point or another. So drawing boundaries between them is kind of, a little bit dubious. But participatory art is foregrounded by early 20th century movements emphasizing spectator involvement and unpredictability, such as Dadaism and Futurism. Participatory art as a genre, capital P, capital A, arose to prominence in the 1950s and the 1960s. Some early canonical works include Alan Caprow's Happenings, very spontaneous, and some of my personal favorites, Lygia Clark's series of propositions. These were propositions basically that she wouldn't call them art forms, she wouldn't call them artworks because they involved other people. Other people's participation were integral to their being an art form. So she would call them propositions to denote this. Some contemporary references are found in the work of Tanya Bruguera. We'll see a photo of one of her works, Tatlin's Whisper, on the next slide. And then participatory art can be broad and encompasses delegated performance, interactive installation, socially engaged art, and more. Can be narrowed down to a particular genre, as I'm kind of doing with the capitalizations, or can be diverse. At the same time that participatory art rose to prominence, interactive art emerges, I think, out of participatory work while integrating the affordances of the technology given in cybernetics and HCI technologies. So an early pioneer we saw was Hanowic's The Senster on the previous slide, and contemporary artist Rafael Lozano-Hemmer produces interactive works like the one on screen here, Recognition 2019. I think this work is really interesting because basically you would walk by it and it immediately captures your photograph. So you have no say, you kind of walk by it and you kind of get snapped and captured into its creation, which is something that will be considered in the second half of this discussion. So why participation and interaction? A lot of times the discussion tends towards the increased spontaneity and affordances that participatory works have, and that is presumably by having more human involvement. When humans are engaged in the process and creation of the artwork, it's not as predictable as having a static work, which presumably produces a more predictable outcome of engagement. You walk around a sculpture, you stare at a painting, and those things can kind of be dependent on how you interpret them based as the experiencer. But in the creation of an artwork, if it includes human beings, then you have that spontaneity and that reception kind of baked into its artistic content. So with participatory and interactive art, the variable is the human being. Who chooses to participate or interact with the artwork will inevitably change the outcome. Art then presumably becomes more complex, spontaneous, and unpredictable the more the artwork's existence depends on the spectator's involvement. You see this, I think, a lot with Alan Caprow's Happenings. You didn't really want the outcome to be concrete and predictable. The whole idea of why it was so, I think, notable and now canonical is because you can't anticipate what's going to happen. Here also is Tanya Bruguera's Tatlin's Whisper, which I think is another work that kind of talks about in the same theme that I'm looking at with kind of like surveillance and participation and this question of agency and consent. Tatlin's Whisper, it's two Mountie police inside the Tate Turbine Hall, and they would kind of walk around and enclose people, kind of like capturing them within the gaze and like the narrowing of the Mountie police. So currently, interaction and participatory art have come to dominate not only processes of artistic creation, this is not a blanket statement, there's obviously lots of other kinds of art, but in the domain of more interactive stuff, but also approaches to curation and institutional programming. I think that this is because of the technological affordances of interaction. You can have AR built into an exhibition curation, like to allow you to do more kinds of programming. There's also an emphasis on the sensorial and the enacted spectator, which engages people in different ways than, say, just kind of distance reflection. And there's so many benefits to having these like more affordances, but I think that there's also things that can be questioned and interrogated, and why that's kind of being privileged over other kinds of artistic creation. And I think another element of why I may be more skeptical of it is when those things get tokenized because of different profit motives. So all those things together, I think, create an interesting melange. And I think a good example of this kind of stuff are these more immersive art exhibitions that are more focused on marketing and engagement in kind of a immediate sense than anything kind of more traditionally, I suppose, like aesthetic. So I guess the question that I have around these things is, why do we want to be more engaged in art making as spectators? And what results from centralizing spectatorial enaction and artistic creation? So this is a screenshot from, I was thinking about all these different like immersive exhibitions, and I feel like my technology now knows that I'm thinking about them so much that I'm always presented them on my algorithms, like go to Transforme and go to this Sweet Folly Oasis exhibition. There's 3 immersive exhibitions, and they're quirky and exciting, and they're full of high arousal. And I think there's this dominance towards, immediacy, the ability to kind of stay focused. And usually it's quite fun. Like, they're fun exhibits, they're highly affective, and they're immediately satisfying. And it's kind of, it mimics kind of more of the digitization and the way that things happen in our everyday lives, especially when you think about kind of the way that we interact with our phone. So what you get is shorter, quicker, more spontaneous artworks premised not only on aesthetics, but on reactivity and high arousal. So I think, in my thinking, that these exhibits emerge out of this combination of the experience economy and the attention economy. So there's a question of getting you in for the experience of engaging with these artworks, and then also a way of capturing kind of your participation. And I think I'm not so concerned necessarily with enjoyment, because I think enjoyment is great, but what is the enjoyment concealing when you are participating? And what is the quandary that is posed then for your capacity to not want to participate in that way? When things are cloaked, I think, purely in these terms of like sweet folly and quirky exhibitions, but are end up kind of tracking your data and concealing kind of more pacifying techniques of like therapeutic participation, which I'll get to in a second. The consequences are not just having fun, but can be kind of more insidious. And that's that element of things that I'm a little bit suspicious of. I think also when you talk about these more insidious things, it's that the experience and the experience economy thing can be sold. And then the participation produces data then as a consequence, which can also be sold. A text that I work a lot with is Janet Cranach's The Digitization of Everyday Life. She recognizes this kind of trend with respect towards more affectively driven participatory works, less kind of critically reflective, things that you have to kind of spend a lot more time with, I think, to kind of reckon with and maybe be a bit uncomfortable, that are premised more on this kind of like pacifying way of relating to artworks, what Bernard Stiegler would call aesthetic conditioning rather than an aesthetic experience. And it's that dichotomy that I kind of want to probe into. Cranach calls this therapeutic participation. So she sees her comparison is particular to Bruce Naumann's Yellow Room, 1974. And what I'm exhibiting here on the slides, which is Olafur Eliasson's 2003 The Weather Project. This was exhibited at the Tate Turbine Hall and was a huge, huge success. It had a large mirror on the top of the turbine hall, and then this sun that is created through monofrequency lights and projection. And a lot of people would kind of reflect on their engagement with it, being like, oh, it was so nice. I just love to lie supine and look at my reflection. And so Cranach comes in and is critical of this in comparison to Bruce Naumann's Yellow Room, which she called a lot more challenging. So you would go in and it was a similar thing. You would parallel these lights, but you would go into these constructed kind of more tight spaces where the lights would be kind of like jarringly bright, and would pose kind of like moments of like, well, what's going on here? And allow you to kind of perhaps critically reflect on the situation and understand something about Naumann's work, whereas she's skeptical, I mean, I guess as am I, about Eliasson's work being kind of this narcissistic therapeutic pleasure. Like you just have a little bit of pleasure and then you're soothed down. It's like, shh, nothing is wrong. Don't be critical. Everything is okay. You're only here to enjoy. Don't think so hard. But I think that what she's critical of is not enjoyment, but the context of enactment and why that enjoyment is particularly foregrounded. And I guess what I'm interrogating is what is backgrounded when pleasure and play are foregrounded in the digital age. is there surveillance, data capture, and behavioral modification that are happening while these processes of pleasure are kind of being depicted as aesthetic experience? And then what happens when aesthetic experience is no longer really the dominant thing, but aesthetic conditioning is? What happens to that critical muscle and relationship to art making that I think makes art so great at calling out things that, you normally would question, like data capture and surveillance and behavioral modification. And if artworks, the trend in exhibitions and curatorial roles make things just about enjoyment, are you able to spend as much time having this critical reflection? So it's that kind of dynamic that I want to kind of poke at. I think in academic circles, like there's, the reason that affectivity and engagement and participation have been so important and vital is because they challenge what has been seen as this reductivity particular to modernism. And you kind of get at these ideas of aesthetic disinterestedness, which is this Kantian formalism that Clement Greenberg, this modernist art critic, would valorize in relationship to modernist artworks, which a lot of people found, I guess, for lack of a better word, problematic in a variety of ways, because it precluded different kinds of interactions with work and privileged a very certain kind of way of interacting with art, which was that you need to be silent and distant and rigid and not touch things. Things about things in art making should kind of be in the white cube of the gallery. And so you have this reversal, I think, and trend towards embodiment, engagement, sensorial relationality, and all these things, which I think are like great. It's not that what that is, not good. I think that those things are all like vital and important in processes of art making. I think what I'm then critical of is when that becomes tokenized and when both of those things kind of fall away, and that the only thing that remains is, I think, this form of affective engagement and enjoyment. And so I think that especially in technological forms of art making and digital works, this immediacy of pleasure and enjoyment, and the idea that we have a right to pleasure at all points in time and to never be challenged, has been enhanced with technological developments in art making, but has subsequently become more precarious because of the way that these artworks are incorporating different data-driven models and forms of what I call capture into their processes of art making. And I think that this is something to think about, not only at a spectator level, but also from the point of being an artist and being a creator, because so many of these things I think can really go into the background in the way that we're working to create art. Because when we think of aesthetics, I think a lot of the time, those political and ethical questions can really kind of fall to the wayside because our intentions are good. But if we're utilizing apps and we're utilizing different forms of technology that have data stores, that's not necessarily only within our own devices, but then become shared to larger networks, I think there's a responsibility to be able to give our participants informed consent and to enable them to be agential, which is the underlying premise of participatory artworks, is that people get to have more of a say in how they engage in that artwork. This came to a head with me for the first time in a way that felt oddly ironic, because I'm thinking about these things all the time. And then in the work that I'm creating, I'm like, oh yeah, I need an app to use my microphone. Great, I'll just download it. That seems like annoying, but I'll do it and I won't think too much about it. And then I was reflecting on my research and I was like, oh, this app, what's happening? Like, if I like record these sounds, does this company then get all these sounds and then do they use them, and what are they using them for? And are these things stored locally? Like, are they mine? Or is something ever mine if it's digitally kind of connected to these larger companies? And so I reached out to the company that I record with, and they were like, everything is stored locally. We don't have any access to your data. Don't worry. And you kind of just then have to trust it. I was like, okay, what do I say after that? I just kind of like, okay, good. like everything stored locally in the workshop. But yeah, these are, I think, just questions that I don't have the answer to, but I'm interested in posing. So I guess I'm also thinking about like, where do you go from these things? What do we do when these questions become posed, and what options do we have? And this is where I kind of want to go, because I don't just want to be critical, but also be, oriented towards an affirmative position. And I guess I see this as moving from an either or to a both and situation with a little bit of nuance. So when it comes to, in the more academic situation, looking at aesthetic disinterestedness and sensorial affective engagement, instead of both of those things. And I guess to qualify, aesthetic disinterestedness is the idea that, like, how to say that succinctly, I guess more of a distanced reflection, not less of an embodied engagement, but being able to, I think, in a more, like, in scare quotes, traditional way of looking at something or ruminating on it, having a period of reflection. Not having those dualisms necessarily be in opposition, but kind of like marrying them into a kind of synthesis. Similarly, like reflection, participation, immediacy, duration. Another thing I think is that making participatory interactive art that still privileges aesthetics, that aesthetics doesn't have to be this negative thing, that aesthetics and beauty and all these things can kind of still be involved in it and can enhance the work, and that it doesn't have to kind of, I think, be primarily driven by economics and just enjoyment, but then also still enjoyment, right? And then in terms of the datification and these questions of the technological capture that I'm calling it, is that providing background information regarding data collection purposes and trying to create artworks that encourage and continuously encourage spectator agency and informed consent. Now I want to move to the workshop portion of this, where I just kind of want to test out, like, is collective affective engagement fun? Did I get any of these things wrong? Is enjoyment it, and to think through some of the data questions, the captures and all that, as we kind of like eat some donuts and think about it. And yeah, that's my idea. Okay, do I take this off now? Bless you.
Sounds like you're hearing. Sorry. Sounded like this. I can't tell if it's muted or unmuted.
I think it's your mic on my laptop.
like, you will be back soon, it's like, we will not be There's your heartbeat. You recording it?